The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Enterprise as Admiral Chester William Nimitz studied the decoded intelligence reports with grim satisfaction. It was June 2nd, 1942, and the Pacific Theater trembled on the edge of destiny. 6 months after Pearl Harbor had awakened America to the brutal reality of war, the Japanese Imperial Navy was preparing to deliver what they believed would be the final crushing blow to American naval power in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had conceived an audacious plan to draw the remaining American fleet into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll. The small coral island, strategically positioned 1,100 miles northwest of Honolulu, would serve as bait for what the Japanese hoped would be the complete annihilation of American carrier forces. Yamamoto commanded the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific: 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, carrying over 700 aircraft and 27,000 men. Unknown to Yamamoto, American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher designated JN-25. Commander Joseph John Rochefort and his team at Station Haipo in Pearl Harbor had been working around the clock, deciphering intercepted Japanese communications that revealed not only the target, but the exact timing of the assault. The intelligence windfall was extraordinary. America would know precisely when and where the enemy intended to strike. Admiral Nimitz faced a daunting challenge. His available forces consisted of just 3 carriers, the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, and the battle-damaged USS Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea with significant damage that should have required months of repair. Instead, Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers performed miracles, completing essential repairs in just 72 hours. The American fleet totaled 25 ships carrying fewer than 400 aircraft, roughly half the Japanese strength. On paper, the odds appeared insurmountable. But Nimitz possessed something more valuable than numerical superiority. He knew exactly where Yamamoto intended to strike, while the Japanese remained convinced their plans were secret. As reported in naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the American strategy would rely entirely on surprise and precise timing. The carriers would position themselves northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, waiting for the perfect moment to launch a coordinated strike against the enemy fleet. Captain Mark Andrew Mitcher paced the flight deck of the Hornet, watching his air crews make final preparations. The Devastator torpedo bombers looked painfully obsolete compared to the sleek Japanese Zeros, but American pilots had trained relentlessly for this moment. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron gathered his torpedo squadron 8 around him, knowing that many would not return from the coming battle. 300 miles to the west, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the Japanese carrier strike force through the pre-dawn darkness. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been the spearhead of Japanese expansion across the Pacific. These same ships had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, devastated Wake Island, and dominated the seas from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean. Nagumo's pilots were among the most experienced naval aviators in the world, veterans of countless victories who had never known defeat. The stage was set for a collision that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. In less than 24 hours, the age of the battleship would end forever, replaced by a new era where aircraft carriers would rule the seas. Neither side fully comprehended that they were about to fight the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the first Japanese reconnaissance aircraft lifted off from the carrier, Akagi, into the star-filled Pacific sky. Vice Admiral Nagumo's strike force was positioned 240 miles northwest of Midway, perfectly positioned for the devastating attack that would begin Japan's conquest of the strategic atoll. The plan appeared flawless: neutralize Midway's defenses, then destroy any American ships foolish enough to respond to the distress calls. 108 Japanese aircraft roared toward their target as the sun painted the eastern horizon with streaks of gold and crimson. Leading the formation, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga commanded 36 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, escorted by 36 Aichi Val dive bombers and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Their mission was to soften Midway's defenses in preparation for the amphibious assault scheduled for the following day. On Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming formation at 5:20 in the morning. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as every available American aircraft scrambled into the morning sky. The defenders included obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, a handful of newer Grumman Wildcats, and Martin Marauder bombers that would attempt to intercept the Japanese fleet. The aerial battle over Midway was swift and brutal. The experienced Japanese pilots systematically destroyed the American defenders, losing only a handful of their own aircraft. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel dumps, and defensive positions, but the damage was less comprehensive than Tominaga had hoped. He radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave. This single transmission would alter the course of history." Nagumo faced a critical decision that would haunt Japanese naval strategy for generations. His remaining aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for use against American warships. Switching to high-explosive bombs for a second strike on Midway would require at least an hour of rearming, time that would prove catastrophically expensive. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive bombers from Midway had already located his fleet. The Martin Marauders, Vought Vindicators, and Flying Fortresses attacked with desperate courage, but scored no hits on the maneuvering Japanese carriers. The obsolete American aircraft were sitting ducks for the defending Zeros, and most were shot down in flames. The attack seemed to confirm Nagumo's assumption that no American carriers were in the area. At 7:15, Nagumo made the fateful decision to rearm his second wave for another attack on Midway. Across 4 carrier hangar decks, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, replacing them with high-explosive bombs. The discarded weapons were stacked carelessly on deck, creating ammunition dumps that would soon prove devastatingly vulnerable. Admiral Spruance, monitoring radio traffic from his flagship Enterprise, realized that the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable during this rearming process. At 7:52, he issued the order that would change naval warfare forever. Launch the attack. The decision was bold to the point of recklessness. His aircraft would be operating at maximum, range with barely enough fuel to return, but the opportunity was too precious to waste. As referenced in Gordon Prange's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, the American strike force consisted of 116 aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet, plus additional planes from the hastily repaired Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bombers, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Hornet's torpedo squadron. The American attack developed into a series of uncoordinated but increasingly desperate assaults. Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese fleet first, approaching at wave-top level in their lumbering Devastators. The obsolete torpedo bombers were no match for the swift Zeros and accurate anti-aircraft fire. One by one, the American aircraft were shot down until only Ensign George Gay remained, his plane crippled and floating in the oil-slicked water, where he would witness the climactic moments of the battle. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At exactly 10:24 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey spotted smoke on the horizon and followed it to discover the Japanese fleet spread out below like a child's toys on a blue carpet. The moment of destiny had arrived. The sun stood high in the Pacific sky as Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey peered down from 14,000 feet at the most magnificent sight any American naval aviator had ever witnessed. Spread across the azure waters below, the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy maneuvered in perfect formation. 4 fleet carriers surrounded by their escorts, completely unaware that death was plummeting toward them from the morning sky. It was 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, and the next 10 minutes would determine the fate of the Pacific War. McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had found their quarry at the exact moment when the Japanese fleet was most vulnerable. On the carrier decks below, rearming operations continued frantically as ordnance crews struggled to prepare the second strike wave against Midway. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, studying reports from the morning's attack. The assault on Midway had been successful but incomplete, requiring another strike to neutralize the island's defenses completely. His crews worked with practiced efficiency, but the rearming process could not be rushed without risking catastrophic accidents. Fuel lines snaked across flight decks while armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes lay stacked in neat but deadly piles. The first American dive bomber began its 70-degree plunge toward the carrier Kaga. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin, Leslie's Yorktown squadron, had arrived simultaneously with McCluskey's Enterprise Group, creating the coordinated attack that American planners had dreamed of but never dared expect. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, drawn down to sea level by the torpedo bomber attacks, was completely out of position to intercept the diving Dauntless aircraft. At 10:26, the first 1,000-pound bomb struck the Kaga near her island superstructure. The explosion detonated the stacked ordnance on deck, creating a chain reaction that turned the carrier into a floating inferno within seconds. Subsequent hits penetrated the hangar deck, where fueled aircraft and additional ammunition created secondary explosions that shook the massive ship to her keel. 90 seconds later, 3 bombs struck the Akagi in rapid succession. The first hit destroyed the flight deck near the amidships elevator, the second penetrated the upper hangar deck, and the third exploded among the parked aircraft. Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as his flagship transformed into a blazing wreck, the carefully orchestrated rearming operation becoming the instrument of the ship's destruction. The Soryu, attempting to launch aircraft in a desperate defense, took 3 direct hits that left her burning from stem to stern. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's pilots had trained for months in precision dive bombing, and their accuracy was devastating. Each carrier that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack was now dying in the flames of its own ordnance. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, launched an immediate counterattack against the American fleet. His remaining aircraft, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, found the USS Yorktown and scored 3 bomb hits that left the American carrier listing and burning. For a brief moment, Japanese hopes revived. Perhaps the battle could still be salvaged. From this unprecedented disaster, the psychological impact on the Japanese fleet was shattering. These carriers had been symbols of invincibility, the cutting edge of Japanese naval power that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. To see them reduced to burning hulks in the span of minutes was beyond comprehension, as documented in Mitsuo, Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway. The battle that doomed Japan. Many Japanese sailors simply stared in stunned disbelief as their world collapsed around them. Admiral Spruance, monitoring battle reports from the Enterprise, realized that the tide of war had shifted in those crucial minutes. The 4 carriers burning on the horizon represented more than ships. They carried with them Japan's most experienced pilots, irreplaceable aircraft, and the aura of invincibility that had made Japanese expansion seem unstoppable. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of Japanese aircrew, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, perished in the flames. These were not merely statistics, but the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, pilots whose experience and skill could not be replaced in the shortened time frame that the war would now demand. As the 3 carriers continued to burn, their magazines exploding in spectacular displays that could be seen for miles, both fleets began to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. The age of Japanese naval supremacy had ended in 10 minutes of precision bombing. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed irrevocably to the United States, though the final act of this drama was yet to be played. The Hiryu, alone and defiant, still possessed the power to inflict damage on the American fleet, setting the stage for the final confrontation of this historic day. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last surviving carrier of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty strike force, watching the funeral pyres of his sister ships paint the afternoon sky with columns of black smoke. It was 2:30 in the afternoon on June 4, 1942, and the captain faced a decision that would determine whether this day would end in complete Japanese disaster or partial redemption. The Hiryu had escaped the devastating American dive bomber attack that crippled the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, but Kaku knew his solitary carrier could not survive alone against the American fleet. His only hope lay in striking back hard enough to level the playing field, perhaps inflicting sufficient damage to force the Americans to withdraw. Every aircraft that could fly had been armed and fueled for what would certainly be the final act of this epic confrontation. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American task force, following the smoke trails left by returning American aircraft. The Japanese pilots flew with the desperate courage of men who understood that their nation's fate rode with them through the Pacific sky. These were among the last experienced naval aviators Japan possessed, veterans whose skills had been honed through years of combat across the Pacific. The USS Yorktown, still recovering from repairs following the Battle of the Coral Sea, had already absorbed punishment earlier in the day. 3 bomb hits from the first Japanese counterattack had left the carrier listing and burning, but damage control teams under Lieutenant Commander Clarence Edwin Aldrich had performed near miracles. Within hours, they had restored power, corrected the list, and brought the flight deck back to operational status. A recovery so complete that Japanese reconnaissance pilots reported her as a different, undamaged carrier. At 2:45, Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through heavy anti-aircraft fire toward the Yorktown. The American gunners, alerted by radar and visual spotting, filled the sky with deadly flak, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. 2 bombs struck the carrier's flight deck, and a third penetrated deep into her engineering spaces, rupturing fuel lines and starting fires that threatened her main engines. The damage was severe enough to bring the Yorktown to a dead stop, listing heavily to port as black smoke poured from her wounds. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned, believing she was beyond saving. Hundreds of sailors slid down ropes into the oil-slicked water, where destroyers waited to pluck them from the Pacific swells. But the Hiryu's ordeal was far from over. Admiral Spruance had been tracking the Japanese carrier's position through radio intercepts and scout plane reports. At 3:30, he launched a strike of 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher. These pilots had already participated in the morning's devastating attack and now returned to finish what they had begun. As recorded in naval historian John Burden Lundstrom's comprehensive study, The First Team, the American pilots approached their target with grim professionalism. The Hiryu presented a tempting target, steaming alone on the darkening Pacific, with only a handful of escort vessels for protection. Her combat air patrol had been reduced to fewer than a dozen fighters, insufficient to repel a determined attack. At 5:05 in the evening, the Enterprise dive bombers began their attack runs on the Hiryu. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator, while subsequent hits destroyed the bridge structure and penetrated the hangar deck where fueled aircraft created secondary explosions. Within minutes, the last Japanese fleet carrier was ablaze from bow to stern, her flight deck buckled and her superstructure collapsing into twisted wreckage. Captain Kaku, severely wounded in the attack, remained on his bridge as flames consumed his ship. The Hiryu continued burning through the night, her magazines eventually exploding in a display that illuminated the horizon for miles. By dawn on June 5th, she had joined her sister ships beneath the Pacific waves, carrying with her the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy. The psychological impact of losing 4 fleet carriers in a single day was devastating to Japanese morale. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, realized that his carefully constructed plan had collapsed into unmitigated disaster. The carriers represented not just ships but the core of Japanese naval aviation, experienced pilots, maintenance crews, and the institutional knowledge that had made the Imperial Navy so formidable. The Battle of Midway's outcome was now decided, but the human drama continued to unfold. The crippled Yorktown, initially abandoned, was being taken under tow when the Japanese submarine I-168 found her with 2 torpedoes that finally sent the gallant carrier to the bottom. Even in defeat, Japan could inflict pain on her enemies. As darkness fell on June 4, 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. The Japanese Navy would never again possess the strength to launch major offensive operations, while American industrial might was just beginning to reach its full potential. The dawn of June 5, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed by the previous day's carnage. Where once the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy had steamed in confident formation, only oil slicks and floating debris marked the graves of 4 fleet carriers. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, receiving battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood immediately that the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably in America's favor. The human cost of the Battle of Midway was staggering and deeply personal. Japan lost approximately 3,100 men, including many of her most experienced naval aviators. These were not merely statistics, but individuals whose skills and knowledge had taken years to develop. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who had led fighters over Pearl Harbor, and Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, a veteran dive bomber leader, perished in the flames that consumed their ships. Their deaths represented an irreplaceable loss to Japanese naval aviation. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, mortally wounded when American bombs destroyed his bridge, chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon his command. His final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto spoke of honor preserved even in defeat. "We have done our best. We are dying fighting to the end." Such was the warrior ethos that drove Japanese naval officers, even as their strategic situation became hopeless. American losses, while significant, were far more manageable. The USS Yorktown, after surviving both the Coral Sea battle and the initial Japanese strikes at Midway, finally succumbed to submarine torpedoes while under tow. Her loss represented not just a ship, but a symbol of American resilience. Damaged at Coral Sea, miraculously repaired in 72 hours, and fighting effectively until the very end. 147 American airmen died during the battle, with Torpedo Squadron 8 suffering particularly devastating casualties. Of the 15 aircraft that attacked the Japanese fleet under Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life raft among the wreckage while witnessing the destruction of the Japanese carriers. His testimony would provide crucial intelligence about Japanese damage control procedures and tactical responses. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, found himself facing strategic reality aboard. His flagship Yamato, the combined fleet that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, no longer possessed the strength to maintain offensive operations. The loss of 4 fleet carriers, more than 200 aircraft, and thousands of trained personnel could not be quickly replaced given Japan's limited industrial capacity. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. As analyzed in military historian Frank Owen's seminal work, The Campaign in the Pacific, Midway marked the beginning of Japan's defensive phase in the Pacific War. No longer could the Imperial Navy project power across vast oceanic distances with impunity. The initiative had passed permanently to the United States, whose industrial mobilization was just reaching full stride. Intelligence proved to be the decisive factor in American victory. Commander Joseph John Rochefort and his codebreakers at Station Hypo had provided Admiral Nimitz with unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. Knowing when and where the Japanese would strike allowed American forces to position themselves for maximum advantage despite being significantly outnumbered. This intelligence triumph would become a template for future Pacific operations. The technological lessons of Midway were equally significant. The battle demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the primary instruments of naval power. Admiral Yamamoto's massive battleship force, including the super battleship Yamato, never fired a shot in anger during the entire engagement. Surface ships had become supporting elements in a new form of warfare, where victory belonged to whoever could project air power most effectively. For Japan, the implications were ominous. The nation's shipbuilding capacity could not quickly replace 4 fleet carriers, while American shipyards were already launching new Essex-class carriers at an unprecedented rate. The USS Essex herself would be commissioned in December 1942, the first of 24 ships in her class that would eventually dominate the Pacific. The pilot shortage would prove even more critical than the ship shortage. Training experienced naval aviators required years, not months, and Japan's training programs could not replace the expertise lost at Midway. American pilot training, conversely, was expanding rapidly with new facilities across the United States, producing thousands of qualified aircrew annually. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the disaster in Tokyo, began to comprehend that the war his military leaders had promised would end quickly was instead becoming a prolonged struggle against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The road that began at Pearl Harbor had led not to Japanese triumph but to the beginning of a long retreat across the Pacific. The setting sun on June 6, 1942, cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance ordered his task force to withdraw toward Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would reverberate through the remaining years of the Pacific War and reshape naval strategy for generations to come. What had begun as Admiral Yamamoto's masterstroke to destroy American naval power had instead become Japan's greatest naval defeat since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. The immediate strategic impact was profound and irreversible. Japan's combined fleet, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was permanently crippled. The loss of 4 fleet carriers represented more than half of Japan's first-line carrier strength, while the destruction of over 200 aircraft and the death of experienced pilots created gaps that could never be adequately filled. The Imperial Navy would never again possess the strength to launch major offensive operations across the vast Pacific theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz, analyzing the battle's results from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, recognized that Midway marked a fundamental shift in Pacific strategy. No longer would American forces be forced into desperate defensive actions. The initiative had passed to the United States, and Nimitz began planning offensive operations that would eventually carry American forces across the Central Pacific to the very shores of Japan. The human stories emerging from Midway revealed both the horror and heroism of modern naval warfare. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued after 30 hours floating in the Pacific. His eyewitness account of the Japanese carrier's destruction provided valuable intelligence while his survival became a symbol of American resilience. Meanwhile, Japanese survivors like Petty Officer First Class Juzo Mori, pulled from the water after the Hiryu sank, carried with them the bitter knowledge that their Navy's invincible aura had been shattered forever. The technological revolution, demonstrated at Midway, accelerated American naval development programs. Recognizing that carrier-based aviation had become the dominant form of naval warfare, the United States Navy expanded its carrier construction program dramatically. The Essex-class carriers, already under construction, would be followed by the smaller but numerous Independence-class light carriers, creating a force that would eventually number over 100 aircraft carriers of all types. Japanese naval aviation, conversely, began a steady decline from which it would never recover. The training programs that had produced the skilled pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor and dominated the early Pacific battles could not quickly replace the experience lost at Midway. Subsequent Japanese carrier operations would be conducted with less skilled pilots flying increasingly obsolete aircraft against ever stronger American defenses. The intelligence triumph at Midway validated American code-breaking efforts and led to expanded programs for intercepting and decrypting enemy communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose station Hypo had provided the crucial intelligence that made victory possible, became a legend within the intelligence community. The techniques developed for the Midway operation would be refined and expanded, providing American commanders with unprecedented insight into enemy intentions throughout the remaining years of war. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative Naval History, the Battle of Midway's influence extended far beyond the Pacific theater. The demonstration that a numerically inferior force could achieve decisive victory through superior intelligence and tactical innovation influenced Allied strategy in every theater of World War II. The principle of fighting smarter rather than merely fighting harder became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The broader strategic implications became clear as 1942 progressed. Within months of Midway, American forces launched their first major offensive operation at Guadalcanal, beginning the long advance across the Pacific that would end in Tokyo Bay. Each subsequent battle would demonstrate American industrial and technological superiority more clearly, as new ships, aircraft, and weapon systems reached the fleet in ever-increasing numbers. For Emperor Hirohito and Japan's political leadership, Midway marked the moment when their nation's strategic situation became ultimately hopeless. The war, that military leaders had promised would end quickly with negotiated peace, was instead becoming a prolonged struggle against an enemy whose resources dwarfed Japan's capacity to compete. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple American naval power, had instead awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial might was just beginning to manifest itself. The Battle of Midway stands as one of history's most decisive naval engagements, ranking alongside Salamis, Lepanto, and Trafalgar as conflicts that determined the fate of nations and civilizations. In 4 days of fighting, the balance of power in the world's largest ocean shifted permanently from east to west. The Japanese Empire had reached its maximum extent and would spend the remaining years of World War II in steady retreat. The memorial services held for the fallen on both sides honored men who had fought with courage and skill in a battle that would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. Their sacrifice had determined that the future of the Pacific would be shaped not by the rising sun of Imperial Japan, but by the industrial might and democratic ideals of the United States of America.